Good morning, everyone. We are here today for the second session of our Zen gardening series together with Alan Clements from Cascades Gardens. So today we will be going over Oriental Gardens, its purpose, its contents. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alan so that we can get on with the session. There will be time for question and answer. Good morning, everyone. We are here today. Sorry about that. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the session and also in between the session when time is appropriate. So if any one of you would like to ask questions, you can very well unmute your mics and address your questions towards Alan. Or if you would not like to speak, you can also put it down on the chat section and we will be very happy to address those questions. So Alan, over to you, Alan. Thank you. Alan, you are muted.
Right, can everyone hear me?
Yes, Alan, wonderful.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to give my second talk on Zen gardening. Gardening with nature. Well, when I welcome people to my garden every day, as I do, I often wonder what is it that draws people to gardens and visiting gardens. Perhaps everyone's trying to get away from being locked up for so long. Everyone seems to want to come and have something to do with nature in a beautiful place. But the question that intrigues me most is that often people say, oh yes, well, we have a bit of Japanese corner in our garden. And I wonder how many people there's so many people seem to want to have a Japanese corner. What is it about Japanese gardens that people want to have a piece of? And the other thing that comes up quite often, and has all through my life, I suppose, really for 40 years or so, is this phrase, one with nature. Well, what does one with nature mean? And I have to say that I've been meditating on this and experimenting with this in my garden for many, many years. Quite an intriguing question, much deeper than its simple meaning. So the idea of the talk today is that I want to explore this idea. What is one with nature? I've done a lot of research over the years. How do you create a natural garden, a sacred space? This word sacred, celebrating nature, relaxing and reflecting. Well, let's see where that takes us. My first ally is that, strangely and surprisingly, Prince Charles, because I found a book called Sacred Gardens, and he had done the foreword of this book. It's worth actually reading it out because, of course, he has the most beautiful garden at his house at Highgrove. And he says, well, it's not just gardening. Creating a garden is of far greater significance than just gardening. He feels that it's a sanctuary, for him, a place of escape from the noise, rush, and often brutality of the world. It's his refuge, a place where humans and wildlife can take sanctuary. And in this way, it becomes a glimpse of paradise. Certainly his garden is like paradise, a sacred space where humanity, nature, and the divine meet in harmony. Well, I have to say I was quite shocked and very impressed with his foreword. And it set me thinking about, well, what is this idea of a sacred garden? Well, the conclusions I've come to is that, in fact, religion has certainly played quite an important influence in garden design. And very often, different countries and different religions look upon nature as God. Or even as a sacred space. Certainly I had that feeling very strongly whenever I was out in the country of India. And temple gardens have existed for thousands and thousands of years, of course, in ancient Egypt, but also in lots of countries like India, Greece, Rome, Iran, China, and Japan. I thought, well, I'm in the course of my business travels, I always took time off to go and find two things. One is the nearest Buddhist temple, or any temple, come to think of it, but also the nearest garden, beautiful garden. Now, thinking back to my childhood, of course, well, there was always this story of the Garden of Eden, wasn't it? All about the apple and Eve's hip and all the rest of it. But most important thing, like the phrase that I found when I looked up Eden on the internet, well, the Garden of Eden was a sacred space where humanity and nature worked together under the watchful eye of God. So that was my first sacred garden that I researched. But I also had in my mind this idea that, do you remember the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? And I had this idea in my mind, and I looked it up. And indeed, it did exist, although there's some question about where it existed. It's one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. So it's a fabled garden, beautified the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And of course, we somehow know the name Nebuchadnezzar, don't we? 600 BC. I wonder if it really looked like that picture. Well, more up to date and more popular, I remember in 1997, a BBC series. We all watch these gardening programs, don't we? And Jeff Hamilton was the gardener of the day, long before Monty Don. And he did a BBC series. I still have the video, a series of videos about paradise gardens. And he was a very practical man. And he was all about crafting and planting a secluded garden. And he was showing you how to do it. His idea, well, he very much believed in getting close to nature. He thought it refreshed the soul. Green shoots are the very basis of life, was his phrase. So his idea was that anyone can have their own little paradise garden, however size of garden you have. If you have a seat and some beautiful things to put around you, you can create your own paradise garden. I was very inspired by that. So I started thinking, well, where are the paradise gardens that I visited? And I remember I dug out some photographs of my time in Spain at the Alhambra Palace. 1300, it was built in Granada and Muslim inspired. And it was all about water, because it's quite a hot place, obviously, in southern Spain. It was all about water, waterfalls, and potted plants. Really attractive and refreshing space. And digging deeper into the research, I discovered that actually the word paradise was from the old Persian language and meant a heavenly garden. And it seems that the oldest paradise garden was 2,500 years old. And you can just see top left and right some of the ruins that they're still there in Iran, and was in the imperial capital of Cyrus the Great. Fascinating that it existed so long ago, divided into four representing the elements: fire, earth, water, air. And it was all about planting to protect them from the desert with pools and water and so on. The meeting of heaven and earth. And there are lots of other beautiful gardens in Iran. The Iranians seem to love nature much as ourselves. And here's one, the Finn Garden in Kashan in Iran. It always starts with trees on the outside of the garden to give a barrier to the desert, and lots of water in there and fresh planting. Here's another one, Narajestan in Shiraz. A lot of plants, I think, there that we can't really grow in this country. But a place I have been to several times in India, created around the Taj Mahal, built apparently in 1648. It is the most impressive building. It has an aura, that white marble and laminated with these wonderful gems and jewels and so on. But it had the most wonderful atmosphere. But the garden was along the same lines as those Iranian gardens, with rows of trees cutting out the outside desert. And this was created by an Iranian architect. And I love Rajasthan in northwest India. And I remember taking an elephant up to this fort, top right-hand picture there. And inside the fort was surrounding its own quiet space. Again, a sacred garden with these lovely fresh areas, quite green compared to the rest of the surrounding area. See the Muslim patterns there. And in Delhi, this tomb, again with a similar sort of garden with the buildings around the outside, and a much watered central space with Islamic shaped patterns and greenery. An oasis in the desert. Well, looking at Chinese gardens, you have to start by understanding the Tao. Maybe you know about this. Many years ago, some 40 years ago, I was given this wonderful bit of calligraphy on the right-hand side of the picture by a professor of Chinese language in Hamburg University, great student friend. And I asked him, well, now, what does this sign mean? He said, well, this sign, can you see there's a degree of flow there to the calligraphy? He said, it means basically how graceful it is to bend with the wind like corn. Basically go with the flow. And 4th century BC, Lao Tzu, who introduced Taoism, the concept of Taoism, wrote the book Tao Te Ching, one of my favorite books. I've read it many, many times in my life. And the idea of the Tao was that we are part of a continual stream of nature. And by accepting this flow, this nature, we can live a life of harmony. And that's the fundamental philosophy that, of course, China has lived with all these centuries. But Taoism had a strong influence on the classical Chinese garden, an example that you see on the right-hand side there. And the gardens were a place to contemplate the unity of creation, the order and harmony that's inherent in the natural world, the Tao. And every garden created, certainly in those early days, was a quest for paradise, integration of nature and work by man, highlighting the beauty of nature, revering nature, and often a miniaturized landscape. Well, we all know about yin and yang, very much integral to the idea of the Tao, the way, with these two basic forces that govern the universe, the opposites yin and yang. When they're united and balanced, that gives you the Tao, the way of life. And the yin-yang garden, which is very much the thinking behind some of them, is by combining elements to balance a garden. So, for example, stone, rock, cliffs, as we have here in the garden, is the more static yin element. And I can't tell you how stable the garden is here at Cascades because of this wonderful 100-foot cliff that we have. But complemented by water and plants, the yang energy. So there's a complement to the solid and the active. And lots of plants with colors red, yellow, and blue. So gardening becomes part of our creating a cycle of harmony and balance in our world. I was always fascinated by some of the interesting riddles or stories that you had in these sort of religions, the Tao and also Zen. And one stuck in my mind. If you mold a cup, create a cup, you have to make it hollow. And it's the emptiness within the cup that makes it useful. And I've often laughed about that. It's a funny way of thinking about things, isn't it? But the whole point of a Taoist garden is that it has that emptiness in the center. Perhaps it's a pond, perhaps it's a lawn, and it's a calm, reflective center. And that's very typical of all Taoist gardens. But at the same time, you have other meaningful features, the mountain peak, symbolizing stability and endurance, as we discussed, water representing lightness and carrying things forward, and lotus, the purity, the symbol of the search for knowledge. In fact, Chinese gardens have a lot of symbolism, and I've just listed some of the things here. I won't go all through them, but bamboo is an old man, plum trees, a symbol of rebirth, peach, longevity and immortality, so on. Friendship, or the willow, opulence, the peony, of course, that's quite logical, isn't it? And orchid, nobility. Well, I thought back in my travels of China and this part of the world, and I managed to find some pictures here of my first Taoist garden in Beijing. And I have to say that I was incredibly impressed more by the statues and the painting and pictures there than I was the garden. And you can see the gate, the entrance here of the Taoist garden is quite ornate. And these roofs, the roofs of all buildings, Taoist buildings, always have the emperor sitting on a chicken on the top of the roofs. Can you see there? You maybe just be able to make it out. And the idea of this symbol was that it was to teach the emperor that he wasn't, he risked being as mortal as everyone else. He wasn't just the ultimate authority in the land. He could easily fall off the roof. Chicken and an emperor there often have other animals as well. But on the right-hand side, some amazing temple guardians, of course, Maitreya Buddha and Chenrezig, using the Tibetan term, the god of compassion with 1,000 arms, 1,000 hands. But inside, I haven't got any pictures, I'm afraid, it was courtyard temple gardens, flagstoned floor, shady trees, and lots of peaceful areas to contemplate, even meditate, amongst lots and lots of beautiful things in plants and pots. Here's part of the garden. You can see it's a long walkway with shady trees and all sorts of plants, including canna lilies, things that I can't grow in my garden. And checking out, of course, a lot of our plants that we have in our gardens come from China and Japan, but these particular Taoist gardens tend to have some of these plants that you see. And I've tried to have these plants in my garden. For example, good old Ginkgo bilboa, top right. I have that as a 15-foot tree in the garden, as well as a little miniaturized 2-foot version, Ginkgo troll. Magnolia and different prunus trees, lots of blossom, and so on. Interesting conifers, the Thuga orientalis. some more here. We'd be surprised if we didn't see the chrysanthemum and the hydrangea. My favorite hydrangea is the aspera varieties. And we have lots of them in the garden here. Rhododendrons, willow, bamboo, and so on. Beautiful peonies. I also remembered a trip I did in 1985 to southern China. It was in the early days when China was just opening up to tourism, and I was actually my honeymoon, I seem to remember, Elizabeth, and we took a trip down into the southwest, into Kunming, which was actually quite a modern city. But we were taken to this amazing area. It was about 5 miles square, which they called the Stone Garden. It had been discovered about 40 years previously, and it was the most amazing escarpment of these wonderful limestone rocks, much eroded over millions of years, quite jagged, sticking up in the air, some of them 50 foot high, and surrounded by pines. Here's another view of it. You get the sense of scale of the rocks with its mixture of trees and shrubs. I remember the tour guide made a big thing of the shapes of the rocks, and everything had to be the shape of an animal. And we spent a lot of the time going around looking at which animals that might be. Is that an elephant? Is that a tiger? And so on. Quite extraordinary. Well, Chinese gardens started, or the idea of Chinese gardens and the concept of gardens went across to Japan in about 600 AD. Basically, it went with Buddhism. The main school of Buddhism started off Rinzai, the 12th century, and it was brought across to Japan. And with that came not only the gardens, but also the green tea ceremony. I don't know whether you've had that with powdered green tea, what looks like a shaving brush in a bowl with boiling water. Rather interesting. The concept of gardening, though, was the Japanese rock garden, as it turned out to be at Karasansui, the dry landscape Zen garden. And this is quite unusual and much publicized. You can see a very much younger version of me all those years ago, sitting in one there, an ocean of gravel, raked gravel, and carefully placed rocks. Quite often it was a miniaturized landscape with rocks and moss. They tend to have moss in the gardens rather than grass. Quite difficult to get going, but probably not in their climate. Prune trees and bushes and raked gravel. Well, over the years, I've been to Japan three times and researched Japanese gardens. I've just drawn up a list here of what I believe are some of the principles of Japanese gardening. Here's our monk sitting in a quiet corner of our garden that cascades. One of the key things of Japanese gardens is to imitate and revere nature. You know, nature was very important in their culture and philosophy. And always rocks, the sound of water, waterfalls and pools, and moss instead of grass, as I said. But unlike some of our gardens at Chelsea Flower Show and so on, where things can be very symmetrical, the whole idea of Japanese gardens is to celebrate actually imperfection and asymmetry. Things were not ordered, they were very natural, no straight lines, irregular pathways, always going off into the distance, and so on. A lady said to me the other day, Alan, I felt really safe sitting in one of your meditation seats in one of the areas. And we realized that what she meant is that it was an enclosed space with some very lush natural planting. She felt safe, and therefore she felt she could relax. And I've discussed that with a number of people since. And in particular, ladies find that very comforting. What I've also found in Japanese gardens is that by having this natural symmetry, there is a sort of a balance and harmony that is quite peaceful and so on. So yes, symbolism plays a part, as we've discussed, but another key thing is that a bit like our British gardens, where, you know, stately homes have what they call ha-has, where they keep the cattle out of from the fields, from the garden, by a trench of water, or so that cows can't come in, but they can still have the benefit of the scenery going miles and miles. So their garden seems to extend into the landscape. And this is one of the ideas in Japanese gardens, borrowing scenery. And we'll see an example of this in a minute, where even though your garden may be relatively small and perhaps even in a city, if you get that wonderful landscape at the back of it, then it seems to be a much larger, relaxing garden. Well, one of the most talked about gardens in Kyoto in Japan is this one here, Roanji. Certainly is a very different sort of garden. It's raked shingle, and there's always a debate about whether it's 15 or 16 stones. This is meant to put over this concept of imperfection. Life is imperfect. We need to come to terms with that. Often these gardens are meant to represent an ocean, perhaps an ocean of wisdom, with islands on the sea. But it also can represent mountains above the cloud level. And it's a little bit difficult to understand that if you haven't experienced that. Under all options, these Japanese gardens all have platforms on one side where you can sit, relax, feel part of the garden, and perhaps meditate. I mentioned this idea of mountains and clouds. Well, I remembered that I did some climbing on that holiday in the west of China, Chengdu. There's a mountain called Omi Mountain, and my wife and I climbed it, and 13,000 feet it was. And the gate, that Taoist gate, is there at the base of the mountain. Can you see that roof again with the emperor on a chicken and the different natural animal figures? The idea of the pointy part of the roof was to ward off evil spirits. Quite elaborate gates for a mountain walk and temple. You can see on the right-hand side, as we climbed to about 9,000 feet, 10,000 feet, we started to come out from what was a rather dark, dank forest, and we could then start to look down on the cloud below, and it was like a sea of cotton wool, and we were climbing through the cloud level. Suddenly the sun came out, blue skies, a wonderful experience. And here we are at the top at 13,000 feet, and you can see looking down this idea of this wispy cotton wool clouds below, and the mountain tops coming through, represented by those Kerasansui dry stone gardens. The story of climbing this mountain was unbelievable because we wanted to see the Golden Temple as it was advertised in those days. And when we got to the top, we found that it had been burnt down by the Red Guards. But we were able to stay overnight in a wooden shack. And I can tell you at 13,000 feet, it's pretty cold. And we had a paraffin stove between about 10 of us, and plum wine, which was not a good idea at that altitude. Anyway, I digress, but it's a memory I shall never forget. For me, the most special and sacred garden in Japan, and I believe it's very famous for such, is in the monastery of Daitokoji, the Daisen-in Garden. Certainly one of the oldest buildings of the Zen sect of Buddhism, and well known for its meditation or zazen. So the Daisen-in temple garden was all about rocks, the mountains, and as you can see, the great raked gravel representing the flow of water. And here's the close-up of the garden itself. Can you see this miniaturized landscape of mountains formed by rocks, and the gravel, the water cascading down the rocks under a bridge and flowing off to the right? It's a beautiful representation of nature. And I was lucky enough to be there before the tourist crowds arrived. I made an appointment with the abbot, and he was kind enough to do a green tea ceremony with me on the platform overlooking this beautiful garden. Lovely man. He spoke just a little English, and I was very proud of his English jokes. And on one side of the garden, you could see this idea of stylizing conifers. This looks like a blue spruce, but can you see the way that they're training the branches, tying them to bamboo to straighten them out, to give this idea of old age? And of course, they very meticulously prune blade by blade of this spiky conifer. They spend hours and hours pruning their trees and bushes. Around the side of this temple, Daitokoji, there's this garden here, a little bit like the Roanji one, but without the rocks. A large expanse of raked gravel. I know that every morning they were coming out to rake that, so it was fresh every day. And just a simple 2 piles of gravel, just as they are. So it's very minimalist, and the whole concept of this is to express the emptiness of self or reality, to concentrate the mind and clear all the everything in the mind that's clouding it, and to clarify things and clear the mind. Wonderful place to meditate. Sorry, I'm okay. Well, I was lucky enough to have friends in the family, friends of the family, I should say, and I was introduced to Mr. Sumitomo. You see him on the picture on the left here, and he was delighted to meet us. My uncle had been a close friend of him many years ago, 50 years ago, in fact. And he said, "Oh, come and have lunch at our family Japanese villa and see the garden." And I was fascinated by this man. He took us to a local park, and as he walked through the park, the crowded paths just emptied. People got out of his way. Even his staff and family walked behind him 5 paces. And to my surprise, I discovered later on researching that he was head of a $15 billion industrial complex there in Kyoto. His house was amazing and fabulous and ancient. And you see the picture of the garden from the meditation platform there on the left where they were sitting. Clipped conifers, raked gravel, moss, very tightly clipped bushes of all types. Do you notice how green it is and not a single flower? Researching it later, I discovered that it's actually created in 1929. This is in the center of the city of Kyoto by a Japanese famous garden craftsman. I can't pretend to understand or pronounce his name, but he was one of the finest garden craftsmen that Japanese ever produced. So I was so privileged to be able to meet this man and see his fabulous garden. But this concept of borrowing the landscape, you can see that it just goes on further and further, even though it was a relatively, well, I think it was a 1 acre garden in Kyoto City, which is, it tells its own story. And here you can see a further view. And can you see how on the edge of the city, the landscape follows at the back of the garden on, and it looks just beautiful, natural, and a fabulous landscape. You can see the empty space in the center there with the pool and the very tightly clipped lawn. Breathtaking. Well, another one of my uncle's friends also offered to take me around the temples, the Buddhist temples in Nara, the wonderful old city of Nara. And you can see him in the middle of the picture, not the priest, the abbot, but Japanese man there called Mr. Kanamori. I was thrilled to meet him, and he spent the day going around the different temples of Nara and introduced me to all the abbots. I got a chance to speak to all the abbots of the temples, just about all of them in Nara, and was able to interview the abbots on Zen Buddhism. It was a great privilege. He turned out to be the chairman of Japanese Railways. It was called the Kinki Nippon Railway, and he was a rather wonderful man, very, very gracious. Can you see, though, on the right-hand side, the temple garden on this particular one with the abbot there, very lush green garden. And here's a close-up. Here's a close-up of it here. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Here's a close-up of the garden. And can you see the clipped conifers with their pads of branches, the different little spirit houses, the pool in the middle with the lotus. And one or two of the trees have blossom at the back there. And one is a magnolia, I believe. Beautiful garden, monastery garden. And I was quite taken by the fact that very, very few flowers. They weren't relying on flowers to create this sense of peace and relaxation. It was the green lushness of it all that gave you that peace of mind. I couldn't resist putting this one in on the travels that year. I can't pretend to pronounce the name of the village up there in the title, but we stayed in these wonderful thatched hotels, ryokans they were called, weren't they? And the scenery is just wonderful up in the Japanese Alps there, where I also went to a Heiji monastery for Zen meditation training. This lady was one of the guests, and she had the kimono put on for dinner. We all went and had dinner, and I took that shot. But just the peaceful surroundings of this area was just wonderful. And I did a tour of a whole range of different monasteries. This is another one of those great gravel gardens, rather too many rocks for my liking, but very interesting, very Japanese. And tight in one of the cities, quite a busy city center, was this garden here with lovely pools. And you couldn't see that you were actually in the center of the city in a very built up area. You had this sense of enclosure, the peace of the water, a really tranquil spot. And an extension of the garden took you into these rather irregular paths. And that's very typically Japanese, and they're meant to be like that. It's drifting onwards. These paths always sort of appear to going somewhere. and irregular paving stones to make you mindful of your surroundings. And often gardens included this stoneware, which actually represented relatives who had died and so on. And each one of those, I think, was a relative that had passed. Rather spiritual. Well, what about Japanese gardens and their plants? Of course, the prunus trees, the blossom in April, very famous. You have to capture the moment because it doesn't last very long. My favorite trees are the cryptomerias, Cryptomeria japonica. Top left-hand picture there is one of the trees in my garden. Cryptomeria japonica seckan sugi, one of my favorite trees. But there's a whole range of cryptomerias. It's not just prunus and blossom. Magnolia, and a really interesting acer in the bottom right-hand corner. Lots of bamboo, different types, junipers, magnolia, rhododendron. Well, I had to put this in, of course, the idea of the lotus, the whole idea of purification, growing in sloppy mud, and this beautiful flower coming above the water, presenting purity. And the spring blossom. Well, a long time ago, 1974, I used to go to Hong Kong quite a lot on business. And this is actually a picture I took right back at that time. There's a lot more high-rise Chinese tower blocks now, but this was a rather dramatic picture from Victoria Peak. But I remember sitting, having a drink with a businessman in a hotel on the other side of the bay here. And he was talking about the hotel, and he said, well, the history of this hotel is rather interesting because years ago, the view that we're looking at through this glass wall, which is so fabulous, was actually a solid wall. And the business was struggling, and they thought, well, let's bring in a feng shui expert. Let's find out what the problem is with this building. And apparently, as the story goes, he came in and said, well, the problem here is that when the dragons come down the hillside and want to drink in the water, they can't get through this big wall. So you've got to open it up, make it glass, and so they'll be able to go down into the bay and take their morning drink. So again, as the story goes, they put the glass in. It's now the most fabulous view. It's much sought after, and it absolutely boomed from a business point of view after that. Slightly silly story, but highlights the concept of feng shui, and I never forgot it. Well, what is feng shui? It links in with the idea of yin and yang, and is fundamental as a philosophy about a balanced garden, if you want to create a balanced garden. And basically, it's about energy. All landscape is alive with forces that have to be taken account of when building anything. It can be a building, but particularly also a garden in my case. And so being aware of this energy or chi running through the garden site is all part of planning a successful garden and making sure that energy flows through the garden unimpeded, energizing the surroundings. So one of the ways in planning your garden to make sure this energy flows freely is don't block it with obstruction, and reshape the garden to make sure that that energy flow is moving well. And then the whole idea of it, of course, is to promote health, happiness, and a sense of well-being. Interestingly, I did some reading on this and did a feng shui analysis of my garden, and it did seem to comply with a lot of the things that they were suggesting. You know, blocking the wild energy in the west with a copse, making sure that the main garden was filled with sunshine in the morning. So it was the bottom of the garden was south facing, getting light in at the right times and so on. It seems to comply very much with feng shui thinking. So to have a balanced garden, to have a feng shui garden, you have to combine all the elements, the basic elements of life. This is a diagram of those, of course. I don't need to read them, but earth, wood, water, fire, and metal. So I've given this quite a lot of thought, looking at Cascades Gardens, my garden. And if you look at the elements, well, comparing to my garden, so certainly the one thing we have an abundance of is rock. We're an old limestone quarry. We have cliff sides around the quarry, and in one section it's 80 to 100 foot high. This is the beginnings of our conifer rockery, recycling some of those rocks. And you can see it's very easy to make it quite pretty with different flowers cascading down the rocks. In fact, the first part of the season, we have this wonderful arabis flowing down the rocks in quite a few places, which seems to have been there for a very long time. I certainly didn't climb 40 foot up to plant it. We've also created our own spaces on the left-hand side there. We've got a system where water is now cascading down the cliff and the rocks into a series of pools, which is really quite pleasant. And I've designed it in such a way that you just feel that sound of water very quietly dripping. As a wonderful place to meditate. We also have a lead mine, and this is a picture of it. It goes 150 feet into the cliff. It's quite dramatic, and it's taken us 20 years to clear it out, and also now put lights all the way down this 150-foot tunnel. It's quite damp and has a lot of fabulous different types of rocks, quite shiny rocks sometimes. Calcite is the main thing. It's almost like a marble, as well as the lead ore. And we've made good use of wood with trees we've had to chop down. So here's an attempt at a stumpery here on the right-hand side. And we've created a wall of logs. And I can tell you now that has developed, and it's cascading plants, small alpine plants growing over the wood. And Cascades has a number of copses, bits of woodland. These are quite ancient copper beeches, and you can see the autumn color is absolutely wonderful. This is just the beginning of it. Of course, it does create a bit of a leaf problem. And we're certainly not short of water. As you can see, all sorts of waterfalls, I suppose about 15 around the grounds, waterfalls of all types in different places, and pools and streams and ponds. This is right at our front door. And the stream flows through. And we have some pretty big waterfalls too around the house. And I'm getting sound but not movement on these videos, but I think you get the idea. After a heavy rain, some of these waterfalls can be quite exciting, to say the least. Well, and to complete the 5 elements of feng shui gardens, of course, we do have plenty of metal, greenhouses, obelisks, and so on. And we're not short of, we regularly have bonfires and fire. So there we go. I think that we do tick off the list of feng shui elements, the natural elements of a feng shui garden. Well, some of my conclusions of all this is that certainly when you sit in a garden, you're connecting with nature. And this is what I tell all our guests when I get a chance to speak with them, that we've offered 15 benches around the grounds where you can sit, relax, connect with nature. Or as the monks would say in Kyoto, be one with nature. And I've often thought that even the wildest parts of the garden somehow have a harmony and balance that calms you, gives you peace of mind. And a lot of people tell me that they feel very peaceful when sitting in the garden. And certainly Prince Charles was right when he talked about a garden becoming a sanctuary, a place for meditation, rejuvenation, even spiritual growth. And I do feel that in my 25 years of creating Cascades Gardens, it has been a spiritual garden, a spiritual journey as well as a gardening journey. And so we call it the meditation garden, beautiful, lush, natural spot. And what we've done is we've put benches all the way around the grounds, in fact 11 in particular, and you can get the idea here on the left-hand side. We call that one the bird's nest because it's quite high up, looking over the fields beyond the garden. Here's that one in the cascade, as we call it, with the water flowing down the rocks and the view down along the conifer bed. This is one of my favorites, a seat overlooking the tufa arch. This is a lovely stone arch made of tufa stone, which is like a volcanic rock, which is found locally here in Matlock, Bath. And with the pot of rhododendrons and the view and the water coming over from the stream under the arch, it's the most wonderful place to sit quietly and listen to that trickling water. Certain times of the year, different seats are magnificent. This one here is when all the rhododendrons that we have in pots are fully out, early May, mid-May. Because we have lime soil, we have all our rhododendrons in pots, but there are quite a lot of them, as you can see. And all the way through the garden, I've tried to create this sort of natural planting. It's very English, it's certainly not Japanese, but because it gives you an enclosed space that's very natural and peaceful, and I think very harmonious, it gives you a very good feeling. Well, we have a visitor's book, and I get a lot of interesting comments, some very, very nice ones. This is a Danish lady who came, rather surprised me with what she said. She said, well, going around your garden is beautiful and soothing, with gifts for your eyes in every corner. And every sight shows you that nature is the great creator of harmony and balance. I was very taken by that, and it certainly opened my eyes to some of the things I've been talking about today. Well, last week, at the peak of the garden season, we had a visit from a Royal Horticultural Society assessor, a rather nice lady called Pilar. And she was Spanish, and she spent 3 hours with me talking, looking at the garden, having a tour of the garden, sitting in all the seats. And she was very kind and was clearly quite pleased with it. I asked her would she put something in the visitor's book, and that's what she has done. It's worth reading because, again, it was quite interesting what she said. She says, well, this is a garden, Cascades Gardens, that takes you on a spiritual journey, a place where you can connect with the natural world, and they in turn help you connect with yourself. You can feel a magic spirituality. And you can also feel Alan's meditative connection with every garden seat. Pure magic. Well, as you can imagine, I was bowled over by that. And we've just been told that they'd like us to be a partner garden, an RHS partner garden from January. Well, so much so now, we're getting such a response and certainly sitting in twilight, this is a picture of our new Buddha, thanks to Aldershot's Buddhist Society who's donated it. Sitting at twilight is the most wonderful silent place, ideal for mental and spiritual well-being. And we're now starting to hold retreats on a regular basis at our B&B and with the garden. Well, that's all I have to say today, but lots more information about our garden, Cascades Gardens, on our website. And I have a video blog, gardenforwellbeing.com, lots of information and quite a few videos of my travels. Come and visit at some point when you can. It's very different every season. We have a Facebook page, and there's my email. Be pleased to hear from you. I have 3 more talks yet. This is the second. The next one is going to be about mindfulness and meditation practice in the garden. And maybe I'll throw in a bit of bonsai because we have a bonsai center here. And this idea of what, how do you create a sacred garden? We are in the middle of using a drone camera to do a video tour of Cascades Gardens. So we'll see how that turns out for my 4th talk. And then to summarize everything, I'd like to talk about my own spiritual journey. I certainly feel I've had one in the 25 years of creating the garden. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, we have some time to allow for question and answer. So is there anyone who would like to ask any question? There doesn't seem to be any questions, Alan.
Well, okay.
Hello, Alan.
Yes.
Can I ask a question? When you put gravel in your garden, we are thinking of doing that. How do you maintain it to prevent the weeds coming up and flowers falling on the gravel and making it untidy? How do you maintain it?
Yes, you can buy these big rolls of cloth, and you can lay cloth underneath all the paths and the raked gravel gardens, which it actually stops the weeds growing through. So it's a very tight mesh cloth, which you can lay underneath.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd just like to make a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want to thank you for your very beautiful and inspiring program today and the videos of your beautiful garden. I myself, I'm in the middle of doing refurbishing my house. So my house is in a mess, and I'm sitting and looking at your picture, and it brought me so much of sense of peace and stillness, because I was hoping to go. I'm a member of RHS and I was going to be at Weasley, but I couldn't find the time. And I also had two of my friends, and we worked out in the garden and used some of the things I learned from you, particularly my question about snares. And somebody who was on the chat mentioned about wool pellets. And the other day, I did find them in one of my local gardening centers. And for whatever it's worth, I put them, and we're having a lot of rain. So I'm hoping that it'll work. But I did notice that the snares used to come out. So it was easy to pick them up. So I don't know that that's what it is, because the cheap pellets have a pungent smell. But the garden does give you all that you are attributing it to. And I've opened up my own breakfast pantry area with glass out into the garden. So whether it rains or whether it's a winter day, the garden is inside the house. And looking at your beautiful gardens, I'm glad I did it, because it does give you a sense of, being with nature and about something about divinity coming into it, and so inspiring. And not only what you get the inspiration from nature and from the universe, but also drawing out your own self and bringing peace, bringing that whole spirituality within yourself, which people forget, because people always go out and think it's just a pleasure for the eyes and it's beautiful, but actually you can bring it all in, and wherever you are, it's within you, to enjoy. So I really want to thank all the time and look forward to the next 3 sessions, particularly the one on the drone, because it'll give a beautiful oversight of all what you offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thank you.
All right, Alan. I think that is all the questions also we have for today. So thank you very much, Alan. So we could bring this session to a close now. So then our next session will be September, the 1st September, the first Saturday of September, that is on the 4th of September. That is when the next session will be. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, Alan, for your time and efforts in doing a beautiful presentation for all of us about all the Oriental Gardens. And looking forward to having you with us again next month. So take care, everyone. All the very best, and I will see you later. We do also have another session on Zen Buddhism, and we are doing the third part of the bull herding pictures, which we did with Udayan earlier. So Venerable Julian Daizan Roshi is our special guest speaker for today, and the session will be at 3 o'clock. So take care and all the very best. Take care, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.